Howdy, and welcome to the Lost Rider podcast. It's an honor and a privilege to address you in the capacity of an interviewer, reporter, and media member. Too many modern media outlets have forgone the integrity and responsibility required of credible information sources. What you will receive here are straightforward discussions with legislators, agency leaders, biologists, engineers, doctors, and countless other experts that have the answers to questions often circulated as kitchen table issues. The title Lost Rider may be thought of literally as well as in the metaphorical sense. While there has been the instance that I was momentarily a little turned around at night in a wilderness area, the idea of being a lost rider in life, well, that fits most folks at some time. These renderings are coming to you in the form of the 25-year-old radio program, The News from the Camp House. It still airs every Saturday morning at 6:30 a.m. Central Time on KULM 98.3 FM out of Columbus, Texas. The original intent was to relate outdoor topics to the general public. Immediately, it was found that all issues are relatable to the outdoors and that people are people. They all play a role and they all have a vested interest. It's this program's desire to answer common questions about how the world works, how it will operate in the future, and what's the holdup? So please listen, enjoy, and never hesitate to contact us with more questions and feedback. Good morning and welcome to this weekend's edition of News from the Camp House, the listening post of the Texas Sportsman Association. This is Herman Brune, and this week's edition is also brought to us by the Shaw's Bend Social Club, country club for folks who don't have a country club. All right, tell you what, we've got a gentleman with us today who is the leading authority on the North American Wildlife Conservation Model, Shane Mahoney. Shane, how you doing?
I'm doing well. How are you today?
Well, sneaking along. Okay, now, I'm trying to do right, but anyway, I've had, questions brought up because I've always advocated, promoted the North American Wildlife Conservation Model. We used it as a big point, recruiting point for our Texas Outdoor Writers Association. And in the old 1957 mission statement from our Outdoor Writers Association, it says that they would promote and advocate the 1937 Wildlife Reclamation Act. Now, the question I had was, when was the moniker, the name of it, the 37 Act gave it financial teeth. It gave it a way to survive. But when did we actually hear the words North American Wildlife Conservation Model uttered?
The words themselves in that term first appeared in the early to mid 1990s, and they were articulated by the man who actually wrote the term itself and also who sort of articulated the 7 principles that we identify with respect to the North American model. The term became, better refined, if you will, and better defined over the next approximately decade. And by about 2001, 2002, of course, the term started to find its way into discussions and channels and meetings and conferences and, discussions within wildlife agencies and so on and so forth. But it really was not until that time period, mid-1990s approximately, that we started to see the genesis of this term, which a lot of people find very interesting because now it is very much commonplace, certainly within the sustainable use community and the federal and state agencies, and NGOs that are part of that community. And many people assume that it was probably around a lot longer. Now, it's important to point out, that of course, the principles, the ideas, the contents, if you will, of what's known as the North American model were in existence, right?
Right.
But the concept was never brought together, defined, and really given legs until that time period, from the mid-1990s to the early part of the 2000s.
Okay. Well, because I have always said, it started with Roosevelt, started at the turn of the century, people started seeing that, there had to be some type of a conservation model. And I, without really doing the research on it, I was kind of under the impression that it was an ongoing model prior to 37, and that the 1937 Wildlife Reclamation Act gave it a funding mechanism that solidified it and made it, made it what it is now. Of course, all the tenets were in place at that time, but the exact verbiage wasn't applied. Now what I'm hearing is until early to mid 1990s, huh?
That's correct. And it's important for people to realize that when we talk about the North American model, another word that's sort of adjacent to that or akin to that would be the North American approach to wildlife conservation, because how we have approached that here in the United States and in Canada, which sort of shared this model, is different from other approaches, such as in Europe, for example, or in Southern Africa, or in South America, And so the model is really a moniker that describes the system of policies and laws and institutions that have over time, beginning with the big revolution that you refer to in the Rooseveltian years, the Theodore Rooseveltian years, that over time coalesced into what we recognize as a definable North American approach. And really the model, of course, is driven by the sustainable use movement, by the regulated harvest of wildlife and fish populations, and all of the institutions, policies, and laws, and funding mechanisms that adhere to that. I think it's important, right, to note that the North American model of conservation, as we talk about it, really is focused on the major aspects of conservation that sort of are related to the sustainable use, the hunting and angling aspects of conservation. There are other elements, there are national parks, there are other elements, of course, that are contained overall within the idea of broader conservation principles. But the North American model really has helped explain, how we came to rescue wildlife, particularly the hunted species, how we came to establish, our wildlife agencies, our state and our provincial agencies and so on, how we raised money to conserve wildlife, all of the enforcement aspects that adhere to hunting and fishing regulations, etc. So it's important that people think about it and think about the tenets, the 7 tenets that are so well articulated now, that they also think more broadly and realize, just how many, institutions, the Wildlife Society, the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, the Wildlife Management Institute, et cetera, plus all the critter agencies, if you would call them that, the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, pheasants, and so on and so forth, the Wild Sheep Foundation, and then all of the very, very pro-hunting organizations, the Safari Club, for example, et cetera, organizations like that really place hunting at its core. All of those things and all the laws and all the policies for the states and provinces, really derive from the principles of the model, but they're now all part of the model too. In other words, the model could not work without state and provincial agencies, and without wildlife societies, and without wildlife management institutes, and so on. So important for the audience to understand that all of that really is in a basket that we label the North American model.
Okay. All right. That's a good point that, kind of everybody's in this thing together. Yes, and I know I've had those discussions with various leaders, Parks and Wildlife, and I've always said, yes, well, the funding mechanism certainly from the 37 Reclamation Act certainly helped the states have a foothold in how to manage, and then which, yeah, it's a little bit confusing because you have all these tenets that were in place, and now all of a sudden you've got a name for it, and I think that's why I have always advocated that this should be in curriculum, because if you've got a name for something, then it makes it more understandable instead of just a big basket full of tenets and say, well, we do all these things, and we just do all these things. Because I've talked to wildlife biologists, and when I bring up that conservation model, they kind of give me a blank stare. And I'm kind of like, well, everybody should at least know about it.
Mm-hmm. Well, I couldn't agree more. And I think you're absolutely right that one of the great contributions that Dr. Geist made, he didn't claim to have created the tenets or created all the institutions and policies and laws. He just gave it a name.
Uh-huh.
And it's an interesting story because the reason he gave it a name was because he thought there were threats to the approach that we had taken and which had been so successful in North America, beginning with the, Roosevelt and Grinnell and Pinchot and all of those famous people we remember 100 to 125 years ago. That he thought this was being placed at risk, and he was challenged that when he said we had a system, as he first said, we have a system in place, and he was challenged to say, well, really, you have a system in North America for wildlife conservation? Well, what is that system? And it was out of that kind of challenge that he eventually sat down and eventually articulated the North American model with its tenets. And I think you're quite right, that having a term like the North American model, with all the complexities that hang underneath it, like the tentacles from a jellyfish,
Yeah.
Having that name is incredibly important because it allows people to say in shorthand something about a very complicated matrix of things that are actually operating to secure wildlife's future.
Right. We're going to reiterate that in the second half. I tell you what, let's take a quick break and thank the folks who let us come on here every Saturday morning. We'll be right back. Thank goodness for all the great sponsors we have here at News from the Camp House. H-E-B Food Stores. That's Stephen Tice at H-E-B. He helps me. He helps the community. He's a great man. I'm so thankful H-E-B loosened him up, lets him go around and sponsor a few things. H-E-B's got all your food needs. It's the greatest food store we got here in Columbus. Thank goodness for H-E-B. First State Bank. You go over to the First State Bank, they'll take care of all your loans, all your deposits, your savings, anything you need. Bunch of great hometown people over there. You got Celia Tobias, John Pollock. Everybody over there is looking out for you. Miss Barbara Barta. It's a great bunch of folks at the First State Bank is also sponsoring News from the Camp House. First State Bank takes care of all my business. Baumgart Agency, Susan Baumgart at the Baumgart Agencies, her and Germania. She told me to plug Germania. Germania is an insurance that she likes everybody to know about. The Baumgart Agencies. Miss Susan and I are classmates, being classmates. She got me out of high school, sat right beside her, put us in alphabetical order where I could copy. And Susan Baumgart over at the Baumgart Agency, taking care of all your insurance needs. Lyco Realty, one of the original sponsors of News from the Camp House. Lyco Realty, the oldest real estate company in the county, and for the last 3 years voted the favorite realtor in the county. Lyco Realty, that's Miss Kimberly Johnson. That's Crockett's granddaughter. More kinfolks and classmates and great people from Colorado County. People from Colorado County helping people from Colorado County. That's great. Oh, thank goodness for all these wonderful people come to me want to be sponsors for News from the Camp House. Good morning and welcome to the second half of this week's News from the Camp House. This is Herman Brune, and we're here today with Mr. Shane Mahoney. Now, he is, by all practical knowledge that I have, the leading expert on the North American wildlife conservation model. You see Shane at all types of hunting shows, all kinds of conservation programs. Shane knows he is the person you go to, and what we talked about in the first half was the history of the North American wildlife conservation model, and whereas I thought this name had been in place for a long time, actually the actual title of it, the actual giving it a name, it's been in practice since forever, but giving it a name actually happened in the early and mid 90s. And then and by what we were talking about, over the next decade, it was really sharpened up and refined. And now, we're really pushing for everyone to understand it. And go ahead, Shane. Yeah, I'm talking about it. I need you to talk about it.
Well, I just think that, as we were saying in the first half of the show, that the idea that we have a name for it, a title for it, is very helpful, because you can walk into a room and you can raise this term now, and at least in informed circles, people know that you're not just talking about one simple little concept. You're talking about all the historical developments that took place, the rise of science, the rise of strong enforcement, the rise of very specific dedicated funding mechanisms, such as the Pittman-Robertson funding, the Wallop-Rowe, Dingell-Johnson packages in the United States, all of the research entities that developed at universities, all those research programs and so on, all the management programs and applied policies that come out of state and provincial agencies and many federal agencies as well. All of these complicated pieces that deserve and often require their own dialogue and discussion, you can encapsulate when you talk to someone and say, oh, we're talking about the North American model of wildlife conservation. And remember that this continent, this is something, and I agree with you, by the way, entirely, that this ought to be something taught in schools, because it ought to be taught, and it ought not to be taught necessarily in a wildlife or a conservation program even. It could be taught just as a part of American and Canadian history.
Right.
Because, what really happened was we had, one of the great devastations for wildlife occurred in North America when the European settlers came here and thought that the wildlife resources were just inexhaustible. They'd never seen anything like this continent, the unlimited lands. They came from, densely packed, densely populated European countries. They just couldn't get over this idea of this vast landscape and all these new species and the abundance of them. 20 to 30 million bison, maybe 5 billion passenger pigeons.
Right.
They just couldn't. They couldn't grasp it really, and they certainly couldn't understand anything about its limits. And therefore, the harvesting and the commercial use and sale of everything from robins to the shorebirds to bison to egret feathers, you name it. Anything that came from the wild and from wildlife was sold for big money. In the early part of the 20th century, a pound of egret feathers used to adorn women's hats and so forth was worth more than a pound of gold. And the result of that was that we just decimated wildlife on this continent at a scale that's almost unprecedented in human history. And we went down to circumstances where most of the common species today, name them, elk, moose, black bear, wood duck, wild turkey, white-tailed deer, etc. Many of the very common species that we identify as iconic today, if we'd had an Endangered Species Act in 1910, for example, a lot of them would have been on it because their populations were so depleted.
Yes.
And yet today, we have turkeys in our driveways, right?
Right.
We have white-tailed deer everywhere. We have tremendous elk populations. And all of this incredible recovery was the targeted outcome, the intention, when the original tenets of the North American model were put in place and became the mission and responsibility not only of our government agencies, like our state agencies and our provincial agencies, but also became the mission of so many non-governmental organizations that use volunteerism and fundraising and so on and so forth to assist wildlife species of various kinds. And the end result is today we again have a continent, Canada and the United States, where these wildlife species are incredibly healthy, and in some cases maybe more than healthy. Snow geese, for example, Canada geese, whitetails in some cases, and so on. And that doesn't happen easily. But what is even more miraculous about the North American model is that we not only recovered those particular species that were so depleted, we also used them continuously by harvesting and then feeding, using the meat, sharing the meat, with our families, with our friends, with our colleagues, and so on and so forth. So we didn't just protect them, in quotation marks, we conserved them. In other words, we used planned, regulated harvests as very much a part of the rescue mission. So we have ended up with much increased wildlife populations, which everyone wants to see. And at the same time, we were able to harvest millions and millions and millions and millions. In fact, tens and hundreds of millions, if you look at it since the turn of the 20th century, of these wild animals, and still have them in abundance.
All right.
That's the Holy Grail.
Yes, sir. All right. So now we'll dice it up a little bit. What happens with predators? Because, as you know, in the last, since 94, there's been the big wolf controversy up in the Rockies, and now they're doing the same thing with a controversy with grizzlies. And it's all based around, is there enough room on this earth for humans and wildlife?
Yeah. Look, that is a very big and a very powerful question. Let me start my answer by saying this. Despite the controversy around these big predators, the grizzly bears, the wolves, the mountain lions, the black bears to some extent, and so forth, despite the controversy, every person in Canada, including every hunter in the United States and Canada, ought to be proud of the fact that we have been able to maintain these big predators in reasonable numbers into the 21st century. Despite the controversy, we ought to be proud of the fact that we still have grizzly bears, and we still have the polar bears, and we still have the wolves, because we could have a continent without them.
Right.
I would like to ask every thoughtful hunter listening to this show, do you really want a continent that does not have the great bear? Do you really want to have a continent that does not have wild wolves anywhere? And I think the answer for most hunters is no, they don't want that. But of course, what they do want is they want to know that the predators can also be managed in a regulated, legal way, just as we regulate moose harvest or turkey harvest or deer harvest or whatever it might be. And of course, there is no question that there is human-wildlife conflict associated with the big carnivores, particularly with the grizzly bears, polar bears to some extent in the north. and also with wolves to a lesser extent, there is a conflict with humans that is of a different nature than sometimes the conflict we have with other species. You know, if you're a farmer, obviously you can have a lot of conflict with overabundant deer populations or elk populations if you have a ranch or whatever, you know.
Right.
Taking feed, I mean, you know, those are conflicts too. And of course, we don't recommend getting rid of all the elk and all the white-tailed deer as a result of it. But with the big carnivores, it's different. Psychologically, emotionally, physically, they can hurt you. They can kill you.
Mm-hmm.
They can eat you. And they can also, of course, kill your livestock and, you know, do other things. They can damage your property and so forth. But just think about this fact, that we have over 1 million black bears on this continent. Over 1 million.
Okay.
And yes, they do damage, and there's no question that they do kill sometimes human beings, and they sometimes very deliberately kill human beings, more so than grizzlies, in fact, because grizzlies usually react to a confrontation with cubs or with the prey they've taken down, but black bears will sometimes very, very purposefully predate on human beings.
Huh.
But we have 1 million of them, at least.
Okay.
And we manage to live with them, by and large. The real question for us, and the real question for them, for the mountain lion, for the grizzly bear, for the wolf, is whether we can find room for us all. And my belief is that the North American model definitely espouses finding room for us all. But I think we might as well be grown-ups about it, adults about it, and recognize that it's never going to be easy to coexist, particularly where there are a lot of people and a lot of these big carnivores. It will always be contentious. It will always be difficult to adjudicate what is the best thing to do. But two things I can say. One is the very thought of a North American continent without the great bear is incomprehensible to me. It cannot be. It cannot be on our list of possibilities. The second thing is we cannot just believe that we can have large numbers, in some cases even small numbers, of these very large carnivores that are potentially dangerous and so forth, living in real close, intimate contact with human beings, and not expect there to be problems.
Right.
And where is the balance?
Well, it's something we'll always be reaching for. Yeah.
Yes, I totally agree. And that's the important point. The important point is that we continue to reach for it.
Right.
We continue to try for it. That's what conservation is about. Trying to find the possibilities in the impossible.
There you go. All right, Shane, thank you. Sorry we're out of time. I think you and I could probably just go on and on. But I really appreciate you being with me and my listeners this morning.
Well, it was a genuine pleasure. Anytime you want to invite me back, please do so, and take care of yourselves and take care of Texas.
Oh, we'll do it. We'll do it. Okay, hang on just a second. Folks, I hope you got something out of this morning's edition of News from the Camp House, visiting with Mr. Shane Mahoney. Now, you just heard the #1 expert in the world. So, that's what we do here. If I don't know something, I'm going to go find somebody that can answer the questions. Now, this weekend's edition was also brought to us by the Shaw's Bend Social Club. Country club folks don't have a country club. Everybody go out right now. Have a great weekend. Have a lot of fun. Be safe. And y'all just remember, pretty much any day is sure a good day to be out in the woods.